Thank you for joining us today for the GIST TechConnect on building a startup from the ground up. My name is Kristina Francis, and I'm the Executive Director at Jobs for the Future Labs, JFFLabs. I'm also a partner at the Marathon Fund, board chair of Black Girl Ventures, and a board member with CivStart. As you can see, I'm committed to two very distinct things. One is helping individuals operate in their genius, and the other is creating pathways for economic advancement and wealth. And today I'll be moderating this discussion. There are many approaches to launching and growing a successful and viable venture, clearing the hurdles on your path to success, from developing the idea for your solution to determining the product fit to overcoming gender bias. It can all be very daunting. Today, we're sitting down with a group of impactful entrepreneurs and ecosystem builders who will share the strategies, best practices, and tips that early stage innovators, like many of you, can use to set on your path to growth and success. Let me begin by welcoming our panel of experts. Nina Dudnik is the founder of Seeding Labs, which provides scientists with the tools and training and connections they need to respond to local challenges. Nina, welcome. Please share more about yourself and your background.
Thanks so much, Kristina. I'm a molecular biologist by training. And my dream was always to use science to make a difference in the world. And that led me to work in international agricultural development across the world, including some time spent in West Africa at a rice research station. And it was my experiences working in science overseas and around the world that led me to start Seeding Labs, to be able to ensure that scientists everywhere have the same access to be able to make a difference with their work and to be able to do the research that changes lives and helps their communities. And I've since, after 15 years of running Seeding Labs, I stepped down and handed the reins over to a successor. And I now work for a scientific device manufacturer in government affairs. So seeing the scientific world and making a difference with science from a slightly different angle.
Great, thank you. And our next panelist is Ting, Shih, founder of ClickMedix. By using a virtual platform, ClickMedix brings much needed medical services into regions too remote to support such resources. Welcome, Ting. Please tell us more about ClickMedix and your background.
Thank you, Kristina. So I'm trained as a computer scientist, and that's my major out of Carnegie Mellon. And honestly, it was difficult for me to figure out how can I impact the world. I knew that's what I wanted to do. Long story short, after having probably 5-6 different kind of jobs, from NASA to banks to pharmaceuticals, I found myself at MIT in the business school. And there was a single class called Development Ventures, where our only assignment was literally phrased as create a business that will impact over 1 billion people. And I thought, wow, that's exactly what I want to do. So we formed a team, and that was the beginning of ClickMedix. And we thought, in order to impact over 1 billion people, we need to create a platform that will help all the other health organizations be able to deliver care more efficiently, virtually, or through mobile phones. Hence started our 10-country pilot, looking at how we can make this work in the most remote areas, and then growing it. Now we're at about 25 countries, including the US, and as far as villages of Uganda, providing similar services, empowering health organizations. And many of the frontline workers are women health workers or women doctors who are delivering impact to their own communities. So very excited and very happy to share more as this discussion goes.
Well, as the audience can probably already tell, we've got two rock stars with us, one going from rice research stations in West Africa to the other 10 country pilots, now 25 countries working in remote areas. So thank you all, one, for your service and your ingenuity, and then for sharing with us today. So let's jump into a few questions. We've all gone through funding and founding a company and have additional experience in investment and ecosystem building. I'm curious from you, what are some of the things that surprised you when you first started your company? And Nina, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think there were a lot of things that were surprising on a number of different levels, right? I went from being a research scientist to being an entrepreneur basically overnight. And most of the people that I was surrounded by, right, most of my network had no idea what I was trying to do or why, right? They were academic scientists, and I sort of left this a very clearly defined career track. And so, it was surprising to me how many people around me just were kind of mystified. What was I trying to do? Why was I doing this crazy thing? I think when you start something new, you get a lot of naysayers. You encounter a lot of people who, at least I did, told me it was never going to work. And ironically, and I learned to tune these people out. And I think that was justified, because I found that 10 years after I started the company, and it was hugely, and we were in 35 countries around the world, and we were doing all this incredible work, I still met people who, when they first heard about it, told me it wasn't going to work. And so that was something that I learned very early on to try to tune out. And I think, this has changed considerably. I'm talking about, almost 20 years ago now. There was not a lot of resources, I was finding, for somebody like me, somebody who was switching careers completely, starting something brand new. I found that a lot of the resources for entrepreneurs seemed to only kick in when you were a big enough company, that I almost felt like it wasn't needed at that point. I needed something for people who are just starting out, which is why, right, GIST is such an important program, that there are more programs like this now for entrepreneurs. I think at the time it was shocking to me how little was available for somebody just starting out.
Yeah, that's great feedback. It's interesting how you talk about the naysayers, and I think one thing to underscore there is if you have the vision, you gotta keep pushing forward on that. Ting, how about yourself?
From my perspective, I'm fortunate enough to have done this, with some resources. It was a classroom structure. So we had guest speakers who, were telling us how they did it. So I think we had some good beginnings in terms of, oh yeah, this is how you do it. And then initially we thought, okay, we'll find some money, and we got that initial money by entering a business plan competition and won. And then that helped us create our first product. Then we thought, okay, now we got money, we made a product, now we can go try it on the users and pilot in hard to reach places and see if it will work there. So we went and piloted. We got a bunch of, users saying, yes, I love it, I would probably pay for it. And we have a bunch of doctors who said, this is awesome, it's the best thing I've ever seen. And then we thought, all right, we're done. This is a proven product, we can roll it out. And then we found out, oh, in healthcare, a lot of times your initial success was done through a pilot, and then the university got some grants that then paid for your pilot. And that grant ends at the end of the year or after however many long time period. And then what they do is they pull everything and stop. So, I'm kind of left shocked and wondering, what about the people we started? We found they have diseases, and then what are we going to do to treat them? I mean, so it was really, really surprising to me, in terms of proving the product, people love it, they might pay for it. And then the funding sources are so varied. And a lot of times in healthcare technology, you'll start with the research group that has funding, that is innovative enough to want to try something new and, garner the resources to start it. And then the next step, it's a huge gap in terms of, well, how will you get people to want to pay for it consistently? Is it doctors that are paying? Is it patients? Is it insurance companies? And then you start to realize the ecosystem of healthcare, or whichever industry you're going through, has so many players, including the government, insurance, pharmaceutical supplies, blah, blah, blah. It's really long. So literally, when I thought I did it, it was the tip of the iceberg. And 9+ years later, I'm actually now exploring, how it all works, how to actually have a business model that's sustainable. What that means is it doesn't stop at a certain period. You grow, you find more users who love your product, and they will continually pay for it because you've demonstrated value and they need it to grow their organization. So it was very shocking. It took me a long, long time, at least 5 years, to learn that. Mm-hmm. So, a really good tip in terms of understanding what revenue model really means, and don't count early success as real success until you figure it out, will this just continue on its own?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. It's really what you just hit on. It's really the journey and commitment of the vision, from idea to market, and the process in between to that sustainable model for the business. And thank you for sticking in there. And I think for me, it was the thrill and optionality of creating what success looked like. So my business was in consulting, and I appreciated the space to pretty much decide and be intentional about who I wanted to serve and how I wanted to create that customer experience. And that was always something that fueled me, in the mornings. And I really appreciate that. So for those of you who are just joining us, we are talking today about building your startup. Our experts are sharing phenomenal background and their perspectives on building a startup from the ground up. So Ting, I have a question for you. How did you determine that your idea would be a successful and viable business? And what were the first steps you took as you decided to turn that idea into a startup and now sustainable business?
So the idea at first was literally a lot of people, billions of people need healthcare. They don't have access to healthcare, but they do have access to their own phones in their pocket. And there are lots of doctors, but just not in the villages, probably in the US or elsewhere. So we thought to connect the two to enable people to use their phones, their mobile phones in their pocket to connect to doctors from anywhere. So that was the idea. In order to see if it worked, we went to rural areas where if it could work there, it could work anywhere. So we went to places with very poor internet connectivity. There's some mobile data that we're trying to prove any mobile data would work. We went to Botswana, Egypt, and some other various countries in sub-Saharan Africa to see if people could actually be helped by a doctor remotely. And remember, this was way pre-COVID. It was about 10 years ago when the concept of telemedicine was completely new in many of these countries. And we were able to show that it did help people. People did like it. And a lot of times, some of these people, and some of them were, we started with cervical cancer patients. They didn't even know they had cancer, and they would be completely lost to, what they're experiencing. We're able to find them, identify them early, and treat them almost on the spot as soon as we saw their potential cancer. So that was, our initial part to see that, okay, this really, really could help people. And as I said earlier, that's not the end of the story. That's not declaration of success. That's really just proving, okay, your product has some legs. Now let's explore it further. I think the hardest part is to figure out who is going to pay for it beyond a grant or research. And eventually, and what we found is larger entities like governments or insurance companies, where they will benefit by identifying their population earlier, the ones with potential really high cost issues and potential risk for mortality or death, and addressing those early. So as soon as we realize that, then we try to figure out, well, how do we get an insurance customer or a government customer? And even with companies that are very well known, it still takes years to get a government client or an insurance client. So we went through various accelerators and different partnerships to get introductions. And in healthcare, it typically starts with a pilot to show that this could really work, and then having a business model, in our case with software license agreement, to figure out how much we're charging per user or per patient. And then that's when it became actually scalable. So it took years to figure out, well, ultimately to scale, we need insurance or government or other larger entities with a lot of patient coverage. If we were trying to recruit patient one by one, we would need localized partners and a lot of them. So it took a lot of time to just learn that. The first learning was, your first business or customer isn't likely the most sustainable one, and they change, your customer base change. And then figuring out, now how do we get this really ideal but really hard to reach customer, and how do we actually figure out a plan to secure those customers. So, love to share more, but a lot of those trial and errors, I think a lot of learnings that, I'm happy to talk about as well.
Yeah, and one thing that you mentioned, you talked about just the declaration of success, but you also talked about the impact you were having on people. And so just for our listeners, I wanted to say that the declaration of success and impact may or may not be the same thing on the journey, and making sure that you are celebrating the impact even while you're still refining the business model. So Ting, thank you for sharing that. And Nina, how about you? How did you measure success on your journey?
Yeah, what you just said actually is very accurate for Seeding Labs as well. So, Seeding Labs grew out of my own experiences and observations, having worked as a scientist all over the world. And so I knew there was a need because I've more or less lived it firsthand. And we similarly kind of, piloted it nights and weekends, right? So one way to start a business is to not quit your actual job and to start the business in your side amount of time, which in some ways is incredibly hard, right, to juggle and exhausting, and sort of you have to split your life and your brain in two, but on the other hand, maybe gives you a little bit of a safety net. And so that's how I started Seeding Labs. And we had to measure success in a lot of really different ways. So the core of what Seeding Labs does to this day is around providing affordable laboratory equipment to scientists around the world at universities worldwide. And this had been done in kind of onesie twosies, individual scientists taking a microscope in their backpack overseas. We were doing it at scale. And that took a lot of iterations to sort of grow to how we could do that efficiently. And I'm a scientist, so you do what you know. And so I collected enormous reams of data on everything that we did, every piece of instrumentation that came through our hands, how long we had it, every process. And so we could measure sort of operational success in very short term, and watch how that got better and better and better over time. But what we really wanted to do was influence how science is done around the world and the success of scientists around the world. And that takes a really long time. Science takes a long time. And so, we had to come up with ways to show that it was it actually making a difference in sort of the short, medium, and long term? And one of the things that I think was very challenging there was to, once your customer, so to speak, gets what they want from you, they're set. They don't, right? And so getting information long term to know that what we were doing worked also entailed this very deep relationship building with all of our customers, so that relationship would last, so that we could actually see the success over the years and years and years. And so, that's something that I think, right, you're running a business, you're like, how many things are coming through my warehouse? How much how much revenue? What's, thinking about, can I call up this customer in 10 years and ask them how they're doing, may not be your priority at the time. And so the relationship aspect to what we did, we had a lot of potential investors who told us all the time, this is very high touch, what you're doing. And so what I strove to do a lot was to automate everything that we could automate, so that we still always had the ability to do that kind of high touch stuff as well. Because ultimately at the end, that proved to be what made it successful and made it really impactful in a way that, just sort of shipping and going would never have done.
Yeah, I thank you for that as well. I mean, again, your stories and what you all are sharing is so inspirational. And I think the theme that I'm getting, it's commitment and hard work. And it reminds me, I'm probably going to butcher this quote. I think it's from Frank Lloyd Wright, around the price of success being dedication, hard work, and a devotion to the things you want to see happen. So I think that kind of speaks to what you both just said. So thank you on that. So I'm curious too, what are some of the challenges to building a startup in different fields? And so med tech versus ag tech, for example, are there significant differences that innovators should be aware of? And we'll start with you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's funny now, I'm working so much more closely on the interface between business and government, even than I was at Seeding Labs. And I see this so clearly, that regulations are so different based on the industries. And that is almost always sort of the biggest differentiator in my mind. Listening to Ting tell your story, really brings home. I spent a lot of time with Seeding Labs trying not to do anything that would involve instrumentation that impacted human beings directly, right? No kind of blood collection, nothing in terms of laboratory, medical laboratories, anything like that, precisely because I knew that the liabilities were going to be enormous. And it was one thing to try to comply with, say, import-export regulations. It was another thing entirely to try to comply with medical, in human subjects regulations and things like that. And so I think, it's an incredible amount. It's something that you might not think about right off the bat. We literally got a call from, I believe it was the FBI's local office in Boston, when they read a newspaper article about us that we were shipping scientific instrumentation around the world. And thankfully, we had already put a lot of structures in place to comply with, all of these import-export regulations in, dozens of countries around the world. So there's layers to things that when you first start out, you try to do your pilot, you don't think about having to comply with a lot of that stuff. And knowing about it and building it in from the very beginning, it saves you a lot of time and heartache later on, I think.
Yeah. And Ting, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think definitely the compliance part. I mean, we do work directly in terms of healthcare delivery, and obviously the very first step before even having a product is securing that for, towards health regulations and understanding the different rules in different countries and where you could deploy. I think hardware is really challenging, different import export rules and taxation and whether you could do it or not at volume. Also very difficult. I think another part that took me really the longest to figure out is who pays for healthcare. So obviously the patients benefit from it, but a lot of times they have insurance, they don't want to pay for it. They think it's either the government's job or their private insurance job to pay for healthcare services, even though it could be more convenient, benefits them. Yet they're very happy to pay for the McDonald's meal or, vitamin pills that doesn't have significant scientific backing. So a lot of that, it's, consumer behavior in terms of what they're willing to pay for. And then really understanding, okay, your payer is not going to be your direct beneficiary. And I think that was the really biggest learning that we had to figure out early on. It's probably 3 more layers up the line, ultimately the government, insurance, and then down you've got providers, and then you've got nurses, and then you've got the people who directly are in front of the patient delivering that care, and you've got family members as well. So I think that's one really big challenge in terms of med tech or healthcare, is that who you made the product for isn't someone who necessarily will pay you for that service. So it's very circuitous, multi-layered, and a lot of lack of transparency in terms of, how do you make a business work in med tech or healthcare?
Those are all great points. And it actually it makes me want to pivot a little bit to kind of just acknowledging that the startup world can be very male dominated. And just as I listen to both of you tell your stories of how you've navigated your business model, how you've navigated building your teams and dealing with some of these regulation issues, I wonder the challenges you had just as a woman entrepreneur facing a male-dominated space, and how did you overcome that? And I'll just start with one area, just as I wear my investor hat. Despite clear outperformance of women, and you two are show that, we still lack access to capital in all fields, not just in kind of the science tech, ag tech space. And so what I'm trying to do is actually create more Black women check writers, women check writers, to help alleviate some of the challenges that we see. But from your perspective, I'm curious on what challenges you have faced as a woman entrepreneur in a male-dominated space. And Ting, we'll start with you.
In my experience, I've always felt so passionate about my project and figure out a way to make revenues early on, that although I realize I need to have investment to really grow it, it's always not the first priority for me. I've seen a lot of other male entrepreneurs where that is the goal. that is the priority. That's why they have a business. The goal is to get the next money and then continue. And I've met a lot of mix of male and women entrepreneurs, a lot of female entrepreneurs. And I heard, Nina, your story resonates as well. We want to do this. We get it done no matter what it takes. If we have to take our own savings, nights and weekends while having a secure job, that's what we do. A lot of times I don't see that as the method for many of the male entrepreneurs I know. And obviously there's a mix, but just so many of the female entrepreneurs I've encountered, we're just so fueled by the solution we're providing that we know we can make it work. And sometimes it is a lot of work going to investors. Most investors by the numbers are male, and people investing projects that they are comfortable with or people they relate to. And, especially, if we're just as an example, if the topic is cervical cancer, you're not going to get as many males investing in it. Topic then, and that's also why we broadened our disease coverage to really all disease, heart disease, hypertension, that affects a lot of males. Okay, now they're listening. So, I certainly think it goes both ways. Females just want to get things done and then take whatever amount of money needed to just get moving. And on the investor side, there are certainly more male investors. And I've always found fundraising just really challenging. I could say the same story, show the same demo and product to an investor, and they're like, and what about this and this? And this? I show it to my clients. They're like, when can you start? Can we use this? It would really help. It's just different feedback and reward in terms of the perception of what you do. And obviously I'm gravitated towards, let me just build more clients. They really need this. And I figure out how to make enough profit to then reinvest into my own company. The investors I did find, we have a seed investor currently. It's DAI. It's a global consulting firm that works around the world, and they really, really understand the impact we're creating, and also the synergy where we could work together in various fields. So I've always found strategic investors are at least more ideal for ClickMedix. I certainly find that, being female certainly means your investor targets, wouldn't be most of the, I'd say, investor who are mostly men. Just understanding what you're trying to do. I do see that as potential difference. So I think just to pull it back, a couple of things. One is females that I know and talk to prioritize getting their solution, building that impact, and then investment is great. They do that in parallel. Where some males I've seen, investment is the priority. That is what's going to keep the company going. Both work. It's just different perspectives, at least in the, in the network that I've been involved in. And then second is from the investor side. A lot of times, I think females tend to lower or describe realistically, let's put it that way, all their numbers, everything. And sometimes they might say, well, let's assume this is the optimistic scenario, and then this is the worst scenario. Where a lot of males, and I've seen this in pitches that I receive as well, they will inflate the reality. So their optimistic scenario is 3 to 5 times more than women's optimistic scenario, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So on the investor side, they're always discounting whatever they hear. And if a woman starts at, realistic, then they got discounted to here, compared to a male who started way higher, then they got discounted to here. It goes all on a spreadsheet, and the women's story numbers just look worse, even though it's a similar impact and solution set. And that's what I've seen a lot as well. So, if we can take those 2 points, I think that will help women entrepreneurs go quite a long way, just understanding those perspectives.
Absolutely. And Nina, for you, what challenges have you encountered as a woman entrepreneur? How'd you overcome them? And we'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah. Listening to Ting, it really resonates with me. And the way that women are, I think by and large, I hate to generalize, but sometimes you do. We are socialized to talk about ourselves in a different way, right? You are brought up to not talk about yourself, to not, vaunt your accomplishments, to, toot your own horn. And entrepreneurship is literally, I mean, the only way you get any attention from an investor is to toot your horn. No one else will. And, and I think as a scientist as well, there's this pervasive idea in the sciences that the work speaks for itself. You hear people say that a lot. It took me about a year into Seeding Labs to realize how ludicrous that was. Right? The work is literally not alive. It cannot speak for itself. You have to speak for it. And the experience that I had that hit this home was, I think it was actually about 6 or so months into running Seeding Labs. And I ended up getting some space in a co-working space. And there was a team of guys, 3 guys. And I said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And their pitch was, right, they use these huge grand words, right? We are catalyzing a renaissance in our sector, right? And I was like, wow, that's amazing. What have you done? Oh, we haven't started yet. We're raising money, right? To Ting's point. They hadn't done anything, but they had already decided that they were catalyzing a renaissance. Whereas when they asked me, right, everything I said was cautious. You're very scientific and very, right, modest. Oh, well, I'm trying to do, we hope that, we think that, I think, trying, right? And I realized listening in that moment that I could not talk like this anymore. I didn't think I could talk like them exactly and feel comfortable with it, but I knew I needed to change how I talked about the work. And, and also to Ting's point that, a lot of the time women start by actually getting the work done instead of talking about it, I actually think can be a strength. Right? Because at the end of the day and over time, what I had was data and more importantly, stories that I could tell about the impact that we were having. And it was much more comfortable to me to tell a heartwarming and moving story about somebody we had helped than to talk about myself. And that I think actually ends up being a strength as well, right? If you can tell really compelling stories about the work you have actually accomplished, as opposed to the incredible vision that you may someday, right? I think that actually ultimately impresses people far more and really gets your business a little bit farther. And that at least was my strategy that I followed.
These are great answers to, I think, great questions. And Nina, I'm going to take with me the work is not alive. You literally have to speak for the work. And I'm going to share that with so many others. I think that's so powerful and such a great reminder. And for those of you who are just joining us, you're watching the Just TechConnect on building a startup from the ground up. And I think let's take a question from the community. And this comes from the Just Innovation Hub. How did you put together a good team as you built your startup? Nina, let's actually start with you and then go to Ting.
Thanks. This was something I actually loved working on, putting the team together. I tried, at least. I may or may not be successful, but I like to think that I am good at identifying what I'm not good at. And so my goal from the get-go was to find people to join the team that were better at things than me. And so I was constantly trying to identify gaps, right? Because when I started, it was literally just me for almost a year. And so identifying sort of what were the most important gaps and the ones that I most importantly could not fill. And what I really tried to do was build out a team of people with expertise in very specific areas. We didn't really have a lot of generalists. We had people with really deep expertise in very non-overlapping areas, but who could then kind of fill in with each other and make those bridges between those areas. And I especially learned to look for people who could roll with a startup environment, which was not obvious from the beginning that is hard for everybody, right? And so figuring out ways to figure out who's comfortable with discomfort, who is comfortable with risk, who's able to say, nobody's ever done this before, nobody on the team knows how to do this, how am I going to do this, and how can I do it as fast as possible and not be afraid of complete failure? And sort of figuring out how to find that in an interview situation was really challenging, but it was a fun challenge. I actually really, as a result, kind of enjoyed interviewing people and hiring people because it was almost in itself an experiment in figuring out how how could we identify the traits that we needed on the team? And then, how do you build the culture once you have everybody and maintain that culture as the company grows, which I think is a totally different set of challenges, right? It's one thing when you're a tiny, scrappy group and you have to figure out how to maintain which aspects do you want to maintain, and maybe which aspects are not actually good as the organization grows.
Yeah, and I think being to that point, being mindful of the transition of growth, right? So from smaller, nimble team to where you might have to put processes in place and, kind of create more of a hierarchy than you had in the past. And so that's also an adjustment that many people make. Ting, how about yourself?
And I echo a lot of what Nina has said. You start with just yourself first, and it is really important to figure out what you want to do, what you don't want to do, and hire people to do those who are better than you than that. And as a healthcare technology company, obviously, I can't write all the code myself. So what components I need is pretty obvious. I need a tech team. I need a chief technology officer, and then software developers. And I think pretty standard in terms of hiring that. I think the one part that was a bit of a surprise is, not every technologist wants to save the world and work for nothing. So, very quickly learned that a lot of technologies, they just love the challenge of the technology problem, how to solve big data problems, how to make the system work, how to make it work in every country. So they really love that hard problem aspect of it. They appreciate the work that we're doing, but I'd say, it wasn't completely in terms of they would do it for free because they can save people. That's where I'm coming from, not necessarily everyone else. I think that was a reality that, I learned, but I think what was really important in terms of building and maintaining a team is understanding why they're doing what they're doing and what's the range of them feeling rewarded for what they do so that they would stay. And they should know with technologists, they're the turnover is like every year, every 2 years, which would be horrendous if you're a startup that you have to keep on retraining people. It takes 3 to 6 months to get them productive. So keeping the good people you have is really, really important, just as important as figuring out who you need on your team, make them happy, keep them, and make sure they get productive. I think a second part is things that I do well, but I want more people to do that part so that we can grow the company. Things like support, sales, marketing. I think those, where we would collaborate and figure out how do you automate a lot of that and how do you do it better, and what are all of the learnings we learned in terms of what's that, recipe in terms of, getting to customers, getting them to buy and supporting them and making sure they're happy throughout. So that's another area in terms of replicating parts of yourself and making sure that can scale. So, because you obviously can't clone yourself multiple times over. So I think, based on what Nina said, finding out where someone else can do a better job, and then adding to that, where could you replicate your ability with more people you hire? And then the third is figure out how do you incentivize someone to stay with your company and be more and more productive.
I think that, thank you for that. The retention is a big one, keeping the good people. And so really making sure you have that reward, incentive, and benefits package. And so working with an HR, someone in HR, an HR company, or someone who can help with total compensation. I think a lot of companies miss out on that opportunity. The other thing that sparked for me when you both were talking is utilizing an advisory committee. I think a lot of times people don't build out a board of advisors or advisory committee in the early days that can help you plan, grow, and scale. And then the other is the full-time versus project-based work and hiring people for project-specific things to get things done versus hiring people specifically for full-time work that goes into Ting, what you just said. So I think all really, really good points. So here's another question from the GIST community. This is a good one. What's been the best part of your journey as a female entrepreneur? And Ting, we'll start with you.
I'd say there aren't that many female entrepreneurs, but the ones we have are very strong and supportive of each other. Even just talking to both of you, it's like, yep, been there, done that, totally understand. And honestly, your friends or even people you used to work with, they won't understand your journey at all. So I definitely seek out the women entrepreneur communities, and there are many online virtual ones. There are also many in-person gatherings. I'd say another thing that was amazing is women put up the best parties. You go to a women's conference, you are going to be treated with decadent chocolates and desserts and really amazing meals. You go to a guys event, you're going to have hamburgers and hot dogs. So I'd say I really love the community aspect and the wine and dine part. And really, it's a treat to, this day-to-day work is so difficult and challenging and a roller coaster ride, as you all know. But, just being able to get together with other women entrepreneurs, supporting each other, tell bad stories, share good ones. I think all in all, very, very rewarding. That plus chocolate and wine can't hurt.
I love it. And Nina, how about yourself?
I have to definitely agree that, the community of entrepreneurs, both men and women that have been able to be part of has been an extraordinary thing. And also just being able to see the difference that Seeding Labs made in the world. When we hit our 10th anniversary, we had an event, we brought, people came in from all over the world, like half a dozen countries. And that was the most extraordinary feeling, was to see not just, them interacting with me and my team, because we had gone out in the field and been to customer sites and all of that, but to see them interacting with each other and those relationships. And that was the vision that had kept me going through all of the very long and sometimes really, really hard years. And so to actually see that had come true was an extraordinary feeling. It was almost like an out-of-body experience. And I will never forget that event.
And I'll just add one piece kind of to that. So with Black Girl Ventures, I think one of the things they've done for their community of Black women entrepreneurs across the US is really create a community that provides psychological safety. And so often we forget about the power of women, as you both just mentioned, just to support one another, share stories of triumph, failure, success, but support each other along the way. So I mean, hands down, they've done such a great job on creating safe space and really that psychological safety. I think that's needed. So I think we have time for two more questions maybe. And I really want to take this one. How do you pick yourself back up after a major business or life failure or setback? Nina, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think this doesn't get talked about nearly enough. That's my opinion. I think especially because you're supposed to be constantly, raising money, raising supporters, getting customers, all the rest. Entrepreneurs tend to put a good face on everything. And so, I went through a year where I thought pretty much day to day, the organization, I was going to have to close the business down. We were basically on the edge financially. And I stopped being able to sleep. I was having panic attacks at 2 a.m. It was terrible. And, and I still had to make sure that my team didn't quit and that, we could keep doing the work and pull through. And I spent, I think, 9 of those months working on what turned out to be transformational funding for the organization. But every single individual day was a marathon to get through. And it was very hard. And I think that having a community of other entrepreneurs was certainly huge. Other people who were maybe not going through exactly the same exact experience, but had been through hard things as well. Other friends, a very supportive family I was very lucky to have. Actual professional psychological support, right? I went to a therapist. I got some medication so I could sleep at night for a few weeks there. So it was a lot of different things like that. And it was ultimately sort of that original vision of what we were going to do in the world with this organization that kept me going. But it also caused me this period to do some things that I would not have otherwise done, to reach out to people who turned out to, be transformational for the business. And so the lesson that I've tried to take from that is to not wait until everything is falling apart or you're in this incredible situation of feeling very desperate to take those big risks. Because in retrospect, when I look at what I thought was this terrifying risk that I then took, in retrospect, it doesn't seem like it was so scary. I don't know why I was so hesitant to do those things and to make those leaps. And it was only because I was feeling like I had no other options that I had the courage to do it. So that's the thing that I've tried to kind of take out of it in retrospect, is at least say, yeah, that was the worst year of my life, but I learned to do some things that that have served me really well.
That's powerful, Nina. Thank you for sharing that. And Ting, how about yourself?
So I have a comparable story, except I actually dissolved the organization we first started. And as I alluded to earlier, the beginning of ClickMedix, that was the company right out of MIT. It was actually called Click Diagnostics. Our team was students, my classmates, and that necessarily isn't a systematic approach to building a team. It's very serendipitous. We got started, we proved it worked, it was great. And then we were looking at potential, really quite a sizable investment. And, when more money is at stake, then a lot of internal team opinions get surfaced. And certainly it resulted in just really different pathways in terms of how we would grow, what technology we use, where we're going to be, which bank account, all of that really nitty-gritty details that caused us to realize, no, we are not aligned as a team. And we had to disclose that to our investors. Obviously, we lost the investment. I think the worst is we were early in the technology. We didn't really know how to support everything. And, we had to, I personally had to take on the fault of the US-based clients that I managed. So that was horrendous. It's almost like getting blamed for something you didn't do, but then you were part of it. So that was a very depressing year. I think I was probably clinically depressed. I don't know. I was depressed. I knew that. But again, if I ask myself over and over daily, after the company is being dissolved, is what do I want to do in life? What is my purpose? It's still the same. I want to do what I said I was going to do, make mobile phone, connect them with doctors so that everyone have access to healthcare. That did not change. What I did learn is in the first version of that attempt, we learned a lot. We learned, well, technology shouldn't be built the way we had it. We need to rebuild it. We need to have different sales structure, different pricing structure. And I think that really fueled me to figure out, well, how do I do it right? In hindsight, what did I learn? How could I do it right? And thus I formed ClickMedix to go in the direction that I wanted to go and grow it from there. And I think, suffering a huge failure and taking all the fault for it, all of that disastrous stuff and feelings, I think eventually I was able to pivot it into what can I do differently? How do I build something that will truly create the impact that we strive for? And then figure out plan. And I certainly reached out to a lot of different people. And Kristina, you mentioned the role of advisors. I suddenly have a lot of advisors talking to a lot of people on, how did you do that? Could you introduce me to this person and that person? And, I had actually an interim CEO to teach me to become a CEO because, I've never been one, didn't know how to do it. What does that even mean? How do I make my first sale? How do I write a contract? So that was super helpful. To learn from someone who's done it. I think another part is just a sense of security that I'm not really just figuring it out. I mean, there are plenty of people who have done this. And I think definitely reaching out, once you figure out, okay, I'm going to do this, then you figure out, well, there are plenty of resources, even more now than when I was going through it for help. So I think that was extremely helpful to pick myself back up and and keep going, because the mission's there. That didn't change. The need is still there. That didn't change. All my skill sets and my purpose, that hasn't changed. So there's nothing stopping me or you, if you're in the same situation, from doing what you thought you're going to do. Just do it.
I love it. Thank you both. I mean, you just highlighted resilience and leadership, making the hard decisions, learning new lessons. And you also touched on, both of you, in some ways, mental wellness and health, and really checking in with yourself and taking care of yourself physically and mentally as a leader. And also knowing when to pivot, knowing when to ask for help, and adjusting when needed. So it looks like we are almost out of time, unfortunately. So before we go, I'd like to hear some final words from each of you, just your advice to the listeners. And Ting, we'll start with you to share some final thoughts.
I've always thought, I'm an immigrant. I came to the US when I was 10. I didn't speak English. And I had to, learn all of that. And then eventually go to college. I ended up studying really hard and become a valedictorian. But I was also very shy. And at that point, the 10-year-old me, it would have been impossible to even think about being a CEO of a global corporation. And I think a lot of that came from not knowing I could do it. But the fact is I could. I am not different than the next entrepreneur CEO. I've got, good pathway and learning and skills and knowledge and network. And I think that goes for all of you out there. People like you have been very successful at building companies with exactly the kind of skill set or potential disadvantages that you perceive to have, and they could do it. I think we have no shortage of resources or advice or people willing to help. I think it's really important to realize what you want to do and that you can definitely figure out how to do it. I think that's, I went to business school to learn probably that as the main point. And, when I reflect back on how did I do it, well, the fact I figure out what I wanted to do and then figure out how to do it. And I think all of us can do exactly that, because there's no shortage of resources out there. There's no shortage of support network. It's really up to you to go and seek those out, and people will help you in believing what you're trying to do, and just do it.
Just do it. Someone else said that at one point. I love it. And Nina.
Yeah, I also would not have pegged myself as an entrepreneur as a small child, or even, frankly, I didn't call myself an entrepreneur until I had been running seating labs for probably 5 years. Because for me, that wasn't the point. And so what I really believe in is finding something that is going to motivate you to do this, regardless of what you call yourself or it, or, it's, you have to find something that you believe in doing, that something that you want to see that in the world that doesn't exist to solve a problem today, that's going to get you out of bed through, hopefully, you don't have the terrible year or so that I had, but not every day is great. And you need to have something that you believe in so strongly that it's going to get you out of bed and get you motivated to do the job every day. And that's more important than sort of, is it entrepreneurship? Is it this? Is it that? Are you doing it for money? Are you doing it for whatever? I think having a vision like that is paramount. That you have that thing that is guiding you towards what you want to create in the world. And you can teach yourself literally everything else. You cannot teach yourself to be passionate about solving a problem. Mm. And so once you find that, everything else is learnable.
I love that. It's about perspective, and as you all demonstrated, hard work. And I think turning the impossible to I'm possible, just that perspective change. When we think about learning, I love the fact that right now you can really teach yourself anything. And I think to live in your genius, it's learn, earn, and return. And there's a give back to everything that we do. And so thank you, Nina and Ting, for joining us and sharing your expertise, experience, and really those details in the story is super helpful. I also want to thank everyone viewing today, especially to the viewers around the globe, for bringing entrepreneurs together to be a part of this conversation. Even though today's program is over, we don't want the conversation about entrepreneurship to stop. Please continue the conversation on Twitter at the hashtag GistTechConnect, and check back here on gistnetwork.org for information about other upcoming GIST events, including programs like this. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Signing off.